Oh,
I've got the
okay
recording
then.
started. So,
Okay, excellent, excellent. Okay then. Well, so we're this is the fifth in a series of webinars that has been commissioned by the New Brunswick Soil and Crop Improvement Association under their OFCAF program, but is also being funded by the Nova Scotia PEI and Newfoundland and Labrador OFCAF program. So, what the objective of this series was do is a bit of a refresher course on some of the aspects of nutrient management planning, with particular reference to how they apply to Atlantic Canada. And so this week we're going to talk about base cation management. By base cations, I mean primarily potassium, magnesium, and calcium. I'm not going to talk so much about sodium because it's not an issue. It's very seldom an issue here in Atlantic Canada. So by base cations, I mean potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Again, this webinar is qualifies for certified educational units. Here is the log on to get credit for that. I will be showing you this again at the end of the webinar, so you can catch it then if you didn't catch it now. In the very first lecture, I talked a little.
I will do some intercropping within the okra and some intercropping within the peppers.
Oh, we have. There we go. In the very first lecture, I said there's some things about the soils of Atlantic Canada that make it unique and make some of the nutrient management challenges unique. And that is that we have naturally acidic soils. They're naturally acidic in part because we have high degrees of rainfall and a high leaching risk, and we've had that over the duration of time that our soils have formed since the last glaciation. We also have concern because we have high degrees of soil organic matter loss because of the way we've been managing our soils. And we want to both understand the impact of that, but also understand how we can address that. And we also have very soils that are quite variable within the landscape, lots of topography and lots of adjoining water bodies. All of those things are of concern in terms of nutrient management, but they also have particular concerns with respect to base cations. Why are our soils naturally acidic? Well, that high degree of rainfall over thousands of years has leached many of the base cations from our soils, and that's why we often have to replenish them. And so it's base cations are one of the particular challenges of Atlantic Canada. So I'm going to talk about four things. Why do base cations matter? How do these base cations behave in our soils, and how does that inform our management? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some 4R management strategies for the management of base cations. And finally, I'm going to talk about the issue of cation balancing. It's a little bit of a controversial topic, and I'm going to try to shed a bit of light on that. So why do base cations matter? Well, about 70% of our agricultural soils in Atlantic Canada need base cations, need limestone basically to both raise pH, but also to provide calcium and magnesium. That's also, by the way, true of most of our forest soils. At least in Nova Scotia, we've been doing a survey of the nutrient status of forest soils, and calcium is often one of the most limiting nutrients in terms of forest nutrition. To basically maintain the pH of our soils as a result of various acidifying agents, which I talked about in the second webinar, we need about half a ton of limestone every year just to sort of keep things as they were. And that has a potential to increase the value of our nutrients that are contained with our soil, and therefore there's something like between a $39 and or $40 and $80 benefit of raising that pH level to a higher level where those nutrients are more available. And generally, when we do surveys of nutrient status, base cation status, we often find that our base cations are need further supplementation. An example being a survey of potassium content of PEI soils revealed a relatively low potassium value. So we need to address this. Well, why? Again, because we have these acidic podzolic soils, naturally have very low pH, high aluminum concentrations. Again, we talked about that in week 2. Most of our agricultural soils have very low cation exchange capacity, and that's the ability of that represents the ability of those soils to retain base cations. So it's not surprising they're leaching out. Um, and often that results in a lot of our soils being relatively less fertile. And so we need to be thinking about some of the consequences of that leaching in terms of the availability of the base cations and how much is needed to correct that situation. And in some cases, a greater reliance on calcitic lime has resulted in some magnesium depletion. So we really need to sort of try to assess where we're at with in terms of these base cations and decide how we want to move forward. Fundamentally, I want to differentiate. So in week 3, we talked about nitrogen cycling. In week 4, we talked about phosphorus cycling. And there were different aspects of those two. One, as I suggested, nitrogen was a very biological molecule dominated by organic fractions. I said that phosphorus was more dominated by inorganic fractions, but still had organic fractions that contributed to phosphorus supply. And so both nitrogen and phosphorus, the conversion of organic matter into a plant available form was an important source of nutrients in those systems in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. That's not true of base cations. Base cations are ionic in nature instead of covalent like carbon and nitrogen, or nitrogen and phosphorus. And therefore there's very little carbon base cation bonds within organic matter, and that's as a result organic matter is not a source of base cations. So we have to think about what are the sources. Most of the mineral sources are from the weathering of minerals or as a result of fertilizer addition, either as a fertilizer or various other organic amendments. So we have a cycle that's largely dominated by inorganic forms. What's also a little bit different than phosphorus is there is not nearly as much capacity to immobilize or fix the soluble base cations concentrations, and therefore it's less of an issue, at least in our soils. It's less of an issue the immobilization or binding of these added forms of base cations, such that we don't have to worry quite so much about the where we're placing them and how we're placing them. It's also really important to realize that while these base cations are not directly involved in the biological molecules like chlorophyll, they are indirectly involved, often as a mediator of an enzyme function. So potassium functions in enhancing photosynthesis and energy relations, not directly by being involved in the enzyme, but being as a cofactor in that enzyme. So it results in enzyme activation. Also really important in water relations. These cations are some of the ionic molecules that allows a plant to retain water and therefore remain upright. And so they have an important structural function within the plant. Calcium is actually an important component of cell walls and the structure of those cell walls. It helps to regulate ion uptake. It's involved in nitrogen metabolism, and it's essential for translocation of various things around the plant, and can also influence the one of the symptoms that we'll see in terms of calcium deficiencies, often the poor formation of various fruits, vegetables, and storage tissues. Magnesium is a critical component of the enzyme chlorophyll. Again, not covalently bonded, but as a cofactor. And it also has a structural component in other very important biological molecules like ribosomes and adenosine diphosphate and adenosine triphosphate. Key molecules involved in energy transformation within the plant. So they have a really crucial role in the function and growth of plants, just not directly bonded to carbon, but indirectly, largely because of their nature as a cation. So their charge is an important aspect of their behavior. If we look at the major crops and some of the pH targets and calcium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium demand, we can see there's a range in demand. Some crops are very high demanding in terms of potassium. Some are more moderate or low. And again, some of that reflects also the pH within which those plants have evolved or have been bred. And again, we see a similar sort of issues with calcium and magnesium sensitivity. Generally, plants don't require nearly as much calcium and magnesium as they do potassium. So they're often our additions reflect that. In terms of a 4R framework, we have to think a little bit differently about 4R in terms of the base cations. In nitrogen, 4R was often an attempt to counteract the fact that nitrogen was so reactive and had such a high potential to loss. So we were very much focusing on timing, the right rate, and the right source to make sure we closely synchronize nitrogen supply with plant nitrogen demand. That's not nearly as great an issue in the base cations. They're not going anywhere too fast, at least not within the growing season. So if we put them there, they pretty much stay there in a plant available form. So similarly with phosphorus, a lot of our 4R in terms of phosphorus management was avoiding contact with the soil so we could reduce the potential for that soil to fix the phosphorus and make it less plant available. Again, that's not an issue with the base cations. So where our 4R is directed at in terms of base cations is often to deal with issues of salt tolerance or salt toxicity, and that may be as a function of the base cation itself, or often the anion that goes along with it. For example, chloride. So an example is the right source. Whether we choose a potassium source that contains chloride or sulfate often has to do with the plant's ability to tolerate chloride, and therefore that's where right source plays in terms of these base cations, in terms of oftentimes the nature of the anion that goes along. Right rate, it's more about trying to make sure we have sufficient base cations there to support plant growth. It's not really about cation balance, and I'll get to that towards the end. Most of the all the labs in Atlantic Canada most of the labs in Atlantic Canada are focusing both on getting the right rate based on the actual demand as opposed to some sort of a storage type philosophy or balancing philosophy. Right time, again, not quite as important in terms of plant uptake. Oftentimes we'll be using right time somewhat as a convenience in terms of getting maybe those base cations on when they have more time to react and is a less busy time. So fall application of base cations is often something that's done, where we would never have considered that in terms of nitrogen or phosphorus because it would have made them less available either to loss or fixation. But in terms of the base cations, that is an option. In fact, in many cases, it may be a preferred option because oftentimes we're adding our base cations as a component of limestone, and we actually may want to have time for that limestone to react. So fall application may actually be the preferred time in terms of these base cations. Again, depending on the degree to which we're looking for relatively short-term raising of the pH. And the right place, again, targeting the root zone broadly. Oftentimes the potatoes, we want to make sure that these cations are distributed through the potato hill because they, in some cases, aren't very mobile. But they're needed. The one issue we often have in terms of right place is how much we place with the seed, and that's usually about the balancing cation, things like chloride. But oftentimes we won't put so much of the base cations with the seed as we would with nitrogen and phosphorus, for example. There's also more application of foliar application as a right place, where we can see some short-term deficiencies that we want to address right away. One example is the use of foliar magnesium. So there's a number of aspects of how these cations behave within the plants that are important to recognize, and it also influences where deficiency symptoms appear or show up in the plant. So potassium is a highly mobile nutrient within the plant. Calcium is relatively immobile, and magnesium is mobile. So these are going to behave, and the deficiency symptoms will show up in different locations based on this mobility. In soil, most of them are moderate to low mobility, but also usually don't leach. Now, if I were talking about this issue in Prairie Canada or in Ontario, I would say these cations don't leach because the cation exchange capacity is sufficient to retain them within the surface. But our cation exchange capacity is so low, and sometimes our soils are coarse enough that we actually can get leaching of these cations out of the soil. So that's the one consideration we have with respect to potassium application, is that if we are on a soil that has really low cation exchange capacity, really low organic matter, is quite sandy, fall application of potassium may not be such a good idea because you could actually potentially lose it over the winter. So in terms of right rate, some of the things we have to be aware of is luxury consumption. We don't want too much, because another aspect of these base cations is they do compete with one another to a certain extent. When the plant takes up a cation, it has to balance it by keep an electronic or ionic balance by emitting a cation. So sometimes there's a competition between these cations for uptake, and so too much of one can actually induce a deficiency in another. And yeah, where are we here? In terms of right time, oftentimes we want to use split applications of these on forage because we want to make that as available as possible. Again, not as great an issue as with nitrogen or phosphorus, but still it is a bit of a consideration in terms of particularly forage stands where we're not incorporating the material into the soil. In terms of right place, you're going to see a lot more broadcast. We didn't like the idea of broadcast in terms of nitrogen or phosphorus. Here, broadcast is a viable option for these nutrients. But again, I guess that also goes with the proviso that we're not broadcasting it on highly sloped land where water erosion or water movement and erosion might move this around within the landscape. But that goes without saying. Okay, let's talk a little bit more specifically about potassium. So potassium is one we noticed, remember we said it was one of those that is very mobile within the plant. It's important in terms of photosynthesis, enzyme reactions, and water relations. Deficiency of potassium will often show up in the lower leaves because if the plant is in need of potassium, it can simply take the potassium that's in the lower leaves and move it up to the growing stem where it needs the new amount of potassium. So potassium deficiency usually shows up in the lower leaves and usually shows up by chlorosis and burn on the tips of the leaves. And also the slower plant growth. And I guess to just reflect a little bit in terms of the second webinar, we talked about soil sampling and trying to whether you could use grid sampling or some other way of determining variability within the landscape. Well, these base cations are an example of where you can actually use plant response to kind of understand how the availability of base cations changes within the landscape, because it's visual. As you see a symptom, you should be saying, okay, I'm seeing the symptom. Where am I seeing it in the landscape and why? And so there is this visual identification of base cation deficiencies, a really excellent way of trying to decide how best to respond to that, either by spot application or broadcast or a general broadcast application for future years. And again, because these base cations aren't lost as rapidly and as quickly as nitrogen and are not immobilized as quickly as phosphorus, what you're seeing in one year can be corrected in the next year. There's a certain amount of carryover from year to year to some extent. Less so with potassium because just so much is needed by the plant. But in general, there is where you're seeing potassium deficiency one year is likely going to be in the the case in the second year if you don't address it. Some of the sources of potassium, you're probably familiar with many of these. So there are KCl, potassium chloride, muriate of potash, a very common source. Again, can be an issue if chloride's an issue. So for some crops, that chloride's a bit of a problem, in which case we often use potassium sulfate or sulfate of potash. And again, it can be used where chloride's an issue. It's a bit more expensive. K-mag or sulfomag is both sulfur and magnesium source as well as potassium, so it has some advantages of being a more providing other nutrients. Similarly, while chloride really isn't considered a nutrient in that it seldom is limiting plant growth, sulfur may be, particularly now since we don't get nearly as much free sulfur in our rainfall that we used to get in the 70s and 80s. But so now sulfur nutrition is becoming more and more of an issue on some of our crops. There is other cyclical economy type supplements, wood ash, and various manures have variable amounts of potassium, really underscoring the fact that you need to test these and measure them to understand what the potassium content is and how that responds to your potassium needs. Again, you see quite a range here. But also they provide other things, other base cations, phosphorus, and manure, nitrogen, carbon. I should also say we often don't think about carbon as a valuable amendment, but of course it is. And I will note that in most cases, biosolids do not contain a high amount of potassium. And why is that? It's because oftentimes the source becomes from a dewatered sewage sludge. And in the dewatering process, the potassium often is sufficiently soluble that it goes with the watered fraction. The solids that become biosolids often don't contain a lot of potassium. Again, you should look at a test because various other ways of processing that material may result in high potassium. But in most cases, biosolids are not a particularly good source of potassium. And in general, we see some recommended rates. There's some crops where we do see relatively high rates of potassium being recommended on soils that test low in potassium. Others crops are less demanding in terms of potassium. And these are just typical sorts of ranges that are based on provincial level soil test soil recommendations based on soil test, in this case, Prince Edward Island. Some of the BMPs and then I'm focusing a little bit on potato production here. So broadcast and incorporate. So there's no real point of banning the potassium. So it can be broadcasted and incorporated into other field operations. It says we want to actually avoid banning of KCl in particular planting because the potential for that chloride to impact the potato tuber formation and the nature of the tuber. In some cases, we're using, again, instead of a KCl, we're using a sulfate-based potassium source to better reflect to reduce the chloride pressure on the crop. Oftentimes we have to put so much potassium on that we may want to split it between a fall KCl. The chloride will dissipate and diffuse through the soil over the fall period, and then returning in the spring with a sulfur-based potassium source to avoid that high chloride content, but take advantage of a somewhat less expensive potassium source. So I did say that we can lose potassium over the fall period, but at least we have some cation exchange capacity, whereas we have almost no anion exchange capacity. So the chloride will almost certainly be leached from the soil, whereas the potassium will be retained to a greater or lesser degree, particularly if you have higher organic matter content. And we don't really recommend in season or late season potassium application. So the right source, KCl for early season, more closer to the mid-season potassium sulfate-based sources. Rate based on soil test, but moderate rates in most cases. But in some cases, we're seeing higher and higher rates of potassium going on our potato systems. Opportunity for fall broadcast. is there, and right place. It's probably most often broadcasting. There's not much a point of banding the potassium. Okay, let's talk a little bit about calcium. And I'm saying calcium and liming here because calcium is usually mostly supplied through the use of limestone. So what does calcium do? Again, we said it is involved in the cell wall structure and permeability. It regulates ion uptake, very important in calcium or nitrogen metabolism. And then it's also essential for movement of a number of compounds throughout the plant. It's important to note, unlike magnesium or potassium, calcium is not, once it's taken up, it forms structures that are not mobile within the plant. They're part of the structural role of this plant, and therefore it doesn't move around. So what's going to happen is if your crop becomes calcium limited, you're going to see it in the new tissues, the tissues that are being formed, and they're going to start to show irregular leaf margins, cupping, these sorts of things. So we see the calcium deficiency in the newer portions of the plant. What are the sources of calcium? Well, calcitic limestone is often the most commonly one used, the most affordable one. In cases where there is a need for additional magnesium in the system, dolomitic limestone, which contains both calcium and magnesium. We talked about pH, we talked about hydrated lime. This one is really used with caution. It has such an intense reaction that it can cause plant demand. I would suggest it should, it's only used when you want extremely dramatic changes in pH, and I would suggest only in the fall when there's time for that reaction to occur before you're putting tender little plants or seeds in the soil. So it's a very intense sort of liming material. Gypsum, this is not really, this is one example of a calcium source that's not really a liming agent. It doesn't really change pH. So it's often used in situations where we actually would rather not raise the pH. In some potato production systems, if there's a risk of scab, we may not raise the pH. In blueberries, oftentimes we're not interested in raising the pH. We want to keep it low. So we would consider a sulfate-based source, calcium sulfate, rather than a limestone type or carbonate based source. Wood ash is a very popular source of calcium materials. Again, it's a liming agent. Depending on the nature of the wood ash, it can contain significant amounts of hydrated style lime, so it can have a very intense alkaline or neutralizing capacity, and therefore it has to be used a little bit with caution. In other cases, the wood ash is not there isn't a lot of oxides there. So again, it's important to get see the soil test or the product material testing for any wood ash you're receiving. The other aspect of this, of course, is what is the metal content of that material? Does it have a high metal content, and is that of concern in your soils? So here's some target pHs, and we talked about this in terms of the lecture, when we talked about pH, the second webinar, and some of the rates we might consider. So typically we're only wanting modest rates to maintain our pH. More variable rates when we're actually trying to raise it from 2 to 8 tons per hectare. In this case of limestone, most cases not more than 6 tons per hectare at a single application, and split it if more is needed. Again, we don't want to create too adverse an environment, and it's not as effective as if you're applying it in one very large amount. Two or three separate applications would be a better option. And again, fall application is the preferred time because we want time for that reaction to occur, for that pH to be neutralized. So really, I'm talking about changing pH here, but remembering we're getting calcium along for the ride with that too. So when do we use calcitic or dolomitic lime? Based on the ratio of calcium to magnesium. I'll come back to ratios a little bit, but here's a situation where in some cases that ratio is important. Okay, so when our soil test is suggesting we're in need of magnesium, then dolomitic lime is the liming source we should be looking at. And again, gypsum, not a liming source, but a calcium source. So again, it's reused when we don't really want to change the pH, but we do want to provide calcium to the crop. It's also a more expensive source. Okay, magnesium. Magnesium does function as a really important constituent of chlorophyll, and it affects a lot of the other biomolecules that are active within the crop. Again, it's a mobile, like potassium, it's a mobile nutrient within the plant. Therefore, what's going to happen when deficiency occurs, magnesium is going to be transported out of the lower portions of the plant and transported up into the growing tissues, the growing tip. And therefore, we should look for deficiency signs in the older leaves, the lower leaves. Somewhat similar to potassium, we're seeing edges being infected, or affected, but also we can see within the central part of the leaf, we can also see some intervenal chlorosis. Okay. Magnesium sources and calcium magnesium antagonism. So again, these are both cations, so there's a little bit of a competition occurring between potassium uptake and magnesium uptake, and oftentimes we're adding much more potassium than we are magnesium. So again, this comes down a little bit into the 4 R's are about the rate or the source of magnesium we're choosing. Dolomitic limestone, most economical when we also want to raise the pH. Potassium, magnesium, langbite can be used when the pH is adequate, but we want both potassium and magnesium is needed. There are some sources like magnesium sulfate. It reacts more quickly than dolomite and is often included in fertilizer blends. And then Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate, it can be used as a foliar application. And these last two don't really contain any potassium. So there are situations where if we need to raise the potassium or the magnesium, but we don't want to raise the potassium, that those kinds of things can be useful. In terms of suggested that we address any magnesium deficiencies before we apply a high rate of calcium on our potassium chloride on coarse textured soils. Again, obviously use dolomitic lime when magnesium is low because it's the most economical source. We can also we have to be a little bit careful with potassium nutrition in terms of forages and this competition with magnesium. So one of the things we might do in terms of our potassium management is split it to avoid a high amount of potassium early in the spring that could induce a magnesium deficiency. So substitute K-mag for part of the potassium source when magnesium is marginal, and often. Here's another example of where, in many cases, the soil test may not be as useful as an actual tissue test to understand the balance of these potassium and magnesium in terms of what the plant is actually taking up. Okay, in general, soil testing is a bit easier for these base cations in that we use MELIC3 uniformly within the region. In part because it is a good broad extractant, useful, very effective on acid soils, but also it means one extractant can give us multiple cations. And that's why we argued that it was a good extractant for phosphorus as well, or at least part of the reason. And so we can define, these in Nova Scotia, we define lower critical values for each one of these. Each province is distinct, so you should consult your provincial recommendations as to what they determine low, medium, and high to be in terms of the soil test values for each of these base nutrients. And notice here, since this is Nova Scotia value, it's reported in kilograms per hectare of K2O, whereas in Prince Edward Island, this would be parts per million of elemental K. So be very mindful of what units are being reported in that in that soil test. And here's where we come into a little bit of a philosophical difference. So in Atlantic Canada, we make our recommendations for base cations based on a sufficiency level of available nutrients. So that's basically saying we're taking a soil test. How much extractable nutrient is there? Do we consider that to be sufficient or not? And that's the basis of the recommendation. A long time ago, a fellow by the name of Albrecht suggested, "Oh no, these are all cations. There's just a right balance, and we want to make sure that we have the right cation balance to ensure that those cations will be properly taken up by the plant." And so sometimes people will refer to a base cation suitable ratio or sufficiency ratio, and suggest that we should be fertilizing to maintain that ratio rather than simply fertilizing to ensure sufficiency of the nutrient based on soil test. And I'll get to that in the next slide. One of the advantages of the sufficiency level of available nutrients is it avoids unnecessary nutrient application. In some cases with the BCRS or BCSR approach, we're adding fertilizer that isn't actually to address a sufficiency or a lack of sufficiency, it's to maintain a balance, and that can be costly. So these two conceptual approaches, so the base cation saturation ratio assumes there's some ideal ratio that we should be achieving. And by establishing that ratio, our system will be more productive. And this is also a concept that's emerging again in terms of regenerative agriculture and even some of the soil health literature. They're starting to think about these ratios again. The problem is there's not a lot of science to support that these ratios are actually effective. There's been a lot of word of mouth type, testimonial type evidence, but not a lot of good science. And most structured scientific reviews find there's very little evidence to support this concept. It is consistent with some scientific principles in that there is cation antagonism. We talked about that in terms of calcium, or potassium and magnesium in terms of grass tetany. And we do know the CEC is finite. So there is competition for that cation exchange capacity. So there is some science to say there might be something there. But in general, we find that seeking some sort of ideal ratio, you're usually applying fertilizer in excess of what the sufficiency level would suggest is necessary. It's also, this kind of approach does not work well on low pH soils with low cation exchange capacity, in part because these nutrients aren't well retained. They're not as well retained as they would be in, for example, Ontario. The sufficiency level, which is being used by most Atlantic labs, it simply makes the recommendation based on cation availability. I think it's the more sound way of making a rate decision. In Atlantic Canada, these two approaches can converge in soils where the pH has been raised to an adequate or appropriate level, 6.5 or something like that. There's not a lot of difference in the two recommendations in those kind of a system. Okay, just in summary here, what are some of the best management practices that we want to be focusing on in Atlantic Canada? Looking at split application of potassium on forages to avoid a spike in potassium availability, inducing a magnesium suppression. That's a very useful technique. Applying our limestone in the fall to allow it to incorporate, but also providing that potassium and or magnesium to the system is why did this pop up? Okay, it's gone. Using dolomitic limestone when magnesium is low, based on those thresholds. And again, most of the soil test labs in the region will make that recommendation as part of their lime recommendation. In many cases, we're looking at gypsum for a potato-based system, particularly where there's a worry about scab, and we want to keep pH relatively low to control scab. In terms of some of these other sources of base cations, we need to have an analysis of our manures because they can vary dramatically in terms of both the ratio of these nutrient sources, base cations, phosphorus, nitrogen, but also the presence of other metals like zinc and copper that we might want to be concerned about. And I'm going to talk maybe a bit more about that next week when we talk about organic amendments. And base cations are one of the areas in which a variable rate may actually be a very economic approach, in part because base cation depletion within the landscape can be quite variable. And so we don't have the same problem across the landscape. There's also a certain degree of carryover from year to year, particularly with calcium and magnesium, such that addressing the situation in one year will also alleviate that situation to some extent in the next year. And because these are not so mobile in soil, it's a somewhat easier to detect and address those situations. Also, this is a situation where visual deficiency symptoms can actually tell us where those zones are that are requiring special attention. So variable rate may be a very practical approach with base cation management, and particularly with limestone. Here's some economics of the various sources of nutrient. At the top, we've got magnesium. Dolomitic lime is by far the cheapest. Epsom salt, the most expensive. We look at calcium sources. The two limestones are much less expensive than the gypsum, but of course the gypsum is also a sulfur source, so that's important to note if you need sulfur. And in terms of potassium, KCl is the cheaper source. Potassium sulfate is quite a bit more expensive, and K-mag is even more expensive. So that influences your choice. It's partly a cost, but it's also partly, is chloride a problem? Do you need sulfur? Do you want to raise your pH? So those are all important considerations in deciding which is the most appropriate nutrient source. So here's the key takeaways I wanted you to get from this week, and I think some of them are consistent from previous webinars. Lime first, then fertilize. I think we don't really think enough about the fact the value of bringing our pH into an appropriate range, how much nutrient it increases nutrient availability for all the nutrients that are already in the soil. So liming should be our first fertility decision, our first nutrient management consideration. Let magnesium drive your lime source, dolomitic versus calcitic. Do you need the magnesium or not? It's more expensive. Do you need it? Match the potassium source to crop sensitivity. Can you tolerate that chloride? You can also manage that chloride a little bit by when you put the potassium on. Putting it on the fall allows the chloride to dissipate somewhat. Split forage K in forages. Split K to manage the magnesium, potassium to magnesium ratio, avoiding that high spike in potassium that could induce a magnesium deficiency. And make your recommendations based on sufficiency, not on some sort of establishing some sort of ideal range, ideal ratio in nutrients. It's sufficiency that we need to be addressing in terms of these base cations. With that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to leave the login material information for the CEU on the screen, but I would welcome any questions.
Questions in the chat.
Oh, there's questions in the chat. Okay, good. I haven't been looking at the chat. I apologize. What is the ideal magnesium count? I don't think there is an ideal one. I think my point is that we shouldn't be seeking those kinds of ratios. I think we should be looking based on sufficiency, based on soil tests. So I don't think we strive for an ideal ratio. And the next question is, if you plant long-term crops like raspberry, asparagus, rhubarb, how and when do you put lime on? Well, I expect most of these, well, no, I shouldn't say that. I mean, many times these crops, they're perennial crops, not annual crops. So your opportunities for soil disturbance are more limited. but you still have the opportunity. They're often row crops, so there's the opportunity of lime incorporation in between the row. In many cases, when we have crops like this, we want to put on less lime more frequently, and ideally incorporate it to some extent, but not necessarily. It's not as critical an issue as it was with nitrogen, where if you didn't incorporate it, could be lost by volatility. There's no volatility for any of the base cations. They don't have a gaseous phase. So I think small regular applications of limestone would probably be appropriate in these systems. And I don't think, again, any incorporation you can do is better, but I think it isn't the end of the world if you can't incorporate it.
Charles Kergamingo has his hand up.
Charles.
Yes. You mentioned, or you wrote, you recommend 400 to 500 kilos of calcitic lime, let's say, every year to maintain the calcium level. And I have seen the high levels of calcium in many soils for certain type of crops. And I'm wondering if the 500 kilos are not contributing to such increases of calcium and even pH. You see, actually, in some crops, you see pH above 7, while the optimum pH should be below that. So are there any research findings to support 500 kilos for maintenance?
So let me clarify. So you need the equivalent of about that rate if you have a situation where your pH is always declining, like if you're adding an ammonium-based fertilizer in a soil that is not well buffered, continually to add that ammonium-based fertilizer will drop the pH. Similarly, if you're growing legumes, they tend to drop the pH a bit. So if you need to continually raise that pH to keep it into that ideal level of 6.5, that's approximately how much nitrogen you're going to need on an annual basis. That doesn't mean you have to apply it every year. So instead of applying 500 kilograms every year, perhaps you're applying a ton every other year or 4 tons every 4 years. So because calcium retains in the soil, it doesn't have to literally be done every year. So, but it's an equivalent rate of about that much for every year. Obviously, if you have a soil that has a very high pH, you don't need limestone. So there you're considering another kind of a calcium sulfate type source where you don't want to raise the pH anymore. Or if you have sufficient calcium, you don't need to put calcium on at all. So I'm not suggesting that in every situation you must add calcium every year. And I'm sorry if that's the impression you got from what I said.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that correction.
John Mars has another question in your chat.
Yeah, so if you have a pH that is about 6.5, there's no need to really raise it above that. Then I think you're looking at something like a calcium sulfate, where it's not really going to have any impact on pH, but it is going to provide a calcium source.
Thank you.
Is a heavier application of potassium in the fall after last cut for forages or alfalfa preferable to a large application in the spring? If equal applications through the year isn't possible. I have to think about this for a second. So one of the issues we have around forage is whether or not the potassium is going to induce a magnesium deficiency. So one of the things I would be worried about is what's your magnesium level? What's the sort of sufficiency level of that magnesium, and would that tolerate a large spike in potassium? Now, if the forage is not being grazed in the fall and you're not worried about grass tetany and during that period, it may well be that that situation will take care of itself. Yeah, it would be based on whether or not you're concerned about magnesium uptake. Oh, you have your hand up. Oh, sorry, that was Gabrielle. Jean-Mar.
Yes. About what I think, it could be possible too. Other cations such as magnesium, potassium, sodium, they also contribute to maintain the pH. Even the calcium availability is an issue. That could be also the case because there is a balance. If one cannot make the pH normal, another one could take the leads. That's what also I would think.
Yeah, and remember that the management of pH is not about the cation. It's about the anion. So limestone, it's not the calcium, it's the carbonate. Calcium sulfate doesn't change pH because that is a strong acid and it doesn't take on the hydrogen ion. It remains dissociated. Carbonate, because it's a weak acid, does take on the hydrogen ion and neutralizes the soil. So the neutralizing capacity of these amendments is not about the cation. It's about the anion. What's with that cation? Does that help you with your question? So it doesn't really matter whether it's potassium chloride or calcium chloride or calcium carbonate. It could be potassium carbonate. I don't know if anyone uses potassium carbonate though. It's a good question. But it's not so much about the cation.
Thank you.
Well, if we have no other questions pressing, thank you again, David, for your excellent.
Do you check? Gabriel has a question on the chat, I think.
Oh, he got that one.
I think we got it. Yeah.
That's good.
I should have read the questions out though. I don't know if I did that. Anyway.
Well, once again, David, thank you. And we'll have a session on Tuesday of next week because it's Victoria Day, right?
Yeah, and I've asked Gabrielle whether it would be possible to move it back to the original time, an hour earlier, so 1 o'clock your time. So I think if that's possible, that will be great. And I guess check your calendars to see whether that happens or not.
Fair enough. Okay. So you're warned. Those participants, the 42 people in here, they're warned that it's be 1 o'clock after Victoria Day.
Yeah, on
Tuesday.
Yeah.
Yep.
We're switching it up on you. And we're going to talk about organic amendments, mostly manure, but not exclusively manure. Okay.
Fair enough.
Take care, everyone.
We'll make the change.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good presentation.
Take care.